The maitre d' had barely finished pulling out her chair when Marco Corsini's voice cut across the dining room like a blade. This table is not available. It was the spring of 1957, and Ristorante Corsini sat at the heart of Rome's most fashionable district. White linen tablecloths, soft candlelight bouncing off gilded mirrors, the gentle percussion of crystal and silver filling the air. Every seat was occupied by someone important: film directors, senators, old Roman families who had been dining here since before the war. This was Marco Corsini's world, and inside it, he was untouchable. Audrey Hepburn looked up from her chair slowly. She had arrived quietly, the way she always did. No fanfare, no entourage, just a small group of three: her personal assistant, a costume designer she had worked with on her last picture, and a young Italian actress named Giuliana Mancini, who had spent the afternoon laughing with Audrey over espresso on the Via Veneto. It had been a perfect Roman evening, until now. "I'm sorry," Audrey said, her voice soft. Corsini didn't lower his. He was a broad man in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told no inside these walls. He crossed his arms and let his eyes move, briefly, deliberately, toward Juliana. The message was clear to everyone in the room. It was clear to Audrey. "This table," he repeated, "is reserved for guests of a certain standing." For a moment, no one moved. The couple at the nearest table stopped mid-conversation. A waiter froze with a bread basket in his hands. Somewhere near the back of the room, a man slowly set down his wine glass and sat forward in his chair. The whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the most famous actress in Europe would do next. Audrey Hepburn did not stand up. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Marco Corsini with complete stillness and said three words that nobody in that room ever forgot. But that moment didn't start there. To understand what she said and why it broke something open in that gilded Roman dining room, you first need to understand who Audrey Hepburn really was, long before the cameras found her. If this story already has you leaning forward, hit subscribe, because this channel is where Hollywood's greatest untold moments come back to life. She was born Audrey Kathleen Rustin on the 4th of May, 1929, in Brussels, Belgium, a city that had no idea what was coming. Her father was a British banker. Her mother, Ella van Heemstra, was a Dutch baroness of old European blood, a woman who carried herself with a kind of quiet authority that Audrey would one day make famous on every screen in the world. The early years were comfortable, even privileged: piano lessons, ballet classes, the particular softness of a childhood insulated by money and routine. Then the war came, and everything shattered. When the Germans occupied the Netherlands in 1940, Audrey was 10 years old. The family had moved to Arnhem, her mother's hometown, a city that would later be torn apart by one of the most brutal battles of the entire war. What Audrey witnessed there was not the war of newsreels and headlines. It was the war of ordinary streets turned silent overnight, of neighbors who were there one morning and gone the next, of a Jewish family taken from the house beside theirs, a mother, a father, two children, loaded into a truck while the street watched and said nothing. She said nothing too. She was a child, but she never forgot their faces. Food disappeared slowly, then all at once. By the winter of 1944, Audrey was surviving on tulip bulbs and whatever could be boiled into something resembling a meal. She developed jaundice, anemia, a respiratory condition that would follow her for years. She danced in secret performances to raise money for the Dutch resistance, small recitals held in darkened rooms with blackout curtains drawn, the audience forbidden from applauding too loudly. She was 15 years old, performing in the dark, keeping herself alive through movement when everything else was being taken away. By the time the liberation came in 1945, Audrey Hepburn had already lived a life that most people never survive. The grace the world would later fall in love with was not a performance. It was what remained after everything else had been stripped away. She arrived in Hollywood in the early 1950s, not as a girl chasing a dream, but as a woman who had already stared into the worst of the world and chosen, deliberately, to be gentle anyway. That gentleness had a spine of iron. Marco Corsini was about to discover exactly how much. Marco Corsini had not built his reputation by accident. Ristorante Corsini had stood on the Via della Croce for 61 years, opened by his grandfather in 1896, passed to his father in 1931, and finally to Marco himself after the war. Three generations of Corsinis had presided over the same white tablecloths, the same gilded mirrors, the same unspoken hierarchy of who mattered and who did not. The restaurant had survived two world wars, a fascist regime, and the chaos of post-war Rome without once compromising what Marco considered its essential character. He was not, in his own estimation, a cruel man. He was a man of standards. That was the word he used with his staff. Standards. It covered everything: the temperature of the wine, the spacing between tables, the particular class of clientele he considered appropriate for his dining room. And in 1957, in certain corners of Rome that still carried the old prejudices, like furniture nobody had gotten around to moving, standards was a word that could mean almost anything a man wanted it to mean. Giuliana Mancini was 24 years old and had grown up in Palermo, in the deep south of Sicily, where the sun darkened skin to a shade that men like Corsini had spent generations deciding was unsuitable for certain rooms. She was warm, funny, startlingly talented. Audrey had met her on a film set 3 weeks earlier and had immediately liked her. They had spent the afternoon together entirely naturally, the way two people do when conversation comes easily and time disappears without permission. Corsini had noticed Juliana the moment the group walked in. His expression hadn't changed, he was too practiced for that. But his decision had been made before they reached the table. When he spoke the second time, his voice dropped, which made it somehow worse. A public insult delivered loudly is one thing. A quiet one, calibrated to reach only the people at the table, is a different kind of cruelty entirely. It says, I don't even need to raise my voice. You are not worth the attention. Perhaps, he said, leaning slightly forward, Signorina would be more comfortable somewhere suited to mixed company. Juliana's eyes dropped to the tablecloth. That small movement, that reflexive retreat, was the moment something shifted in Audrey Hepburn's chest. She had seen that look before, on a street in Arnhem, on faces that had learned, through long practice, to make themselves smaller when the wrong person walked into the room. She was not going to look away this time. She set her napkin on the table, carefully. The way you set something down when your hands need a moment to decide what they are going to do next. Then Audrey Hepburn stood up. She did not push her chair back dramatically. She did not raise her chin in the theatrical way that lesser moments might have demanded. She simply rose, unhurried, completely straight-backed, and for the first time since Marco Corsini had opened his mouth, the full weight of who she was filled the room. Not the actress, not the Oscar winner, not the face on 1,000 magazine covers. Something older than all of that. Something that had stood in a darkened doorway in Arnhem at 10 years old and watched a family disappear and carried that image, without speaking of it, for 17 years. She turned to face the room. Not just Corsini, the whole room. Sit down, Marco. Not a question, not a trembling plea dressed up as dignity, a statement, delivered as quietly and completely as a door being closed from the inside. The kind of voice that does not need volume because it has already decided. Corsini blinked. In 61 years of Ristorante Corsini, across 3 generations of the family name, nobody had ever spoken to the owner that way inside these walls. His mouth opened slightly. Nothing came out. Audrey did not wait for him to recover. She spoke to the room the way she had once danced in darkened cellars, not for applause, not for effect, but because silence had become impossible. She told them what she had seen as a child, not dramatically, almost quietly, how the streets of Arnhem had emptied overnight, how a woman who looked not so different from Juliana, dark haired, dark eyed, born in the wrong place at the wrong moment in history, had been pulled from her doorway one morning while the neighbors watched from behind their curtains and told themselves there was nothing to be done. I was 8 years old, Audrey said, and the men who decided she didn't belong, they also believed they had standards. The room was absolutely still. I have spent my entire life trying to understand how ordinary people allow extraordinary cruelty to happen right in front of them. She paused. Her eyes moved across the tables, not accusingly, but with a kind of patient sorrow that was somehow worse than anger. And the answer, every single time, is the same. They were comfortable. And comfort is very easy to protect when you are not the one being asked to leave. Gerald Farrow, the American producer sitting alone at the corner table, set both hands flat on the tablecloth. His jaw was tight. He had grown up in Mississippi. He knew exactly what he was watching. Corsini's face had gone through several colors by now and had settled somewhere between gray and the particular white of a man who has just understood for the first time what he actually looks like from the outside. Audrey turned back to him. Her voice, when it came, was not unkind. "Your restaurant is beautiful, Marco." A brief pause. "What a shame about the owner." She looked at Juliana, who was sitting perfectly still, her eyes bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite relief, but existed in the narrow space between the two, and held out her hand. "Shall we?" They walked out together, the four of them, into the warm Roman night, and behind them, in the gilded dining room of Ristorante Corsini, Gerald Farrow began to clap, slowly at first. Then a woman near the window joined, then the table beside her, then the entire restaurant, every diner, every waiter, even the young boy clearing glasses near the kitchen door, rose to their feet. Marco Corsini stood alone in the center of his dining room, surrounded by applause meant for a woman who was already gone. The four women found a small trattoria 3 streets away, red checkered tablecloths, a handwritten menu, an owner who seated them without a second glance and brought a basket of bread before they had even opened their menus. Audrey ordered the pasta. Juliana ordered the same. They ate slowly, and they laughed, and by the time the wine arrived, the evening had become something else entirely, something lighter, almost defiant in its ordinariness. Juliana did not bring up what had happened at Corsini's, not directly. At one point, midway through the meal, she reached across the table and briefly covered Audrey's hand with her own. No words. Audrey simply nodded, the way you nod when language would only make something smaller than it already is. Back on the Via della Croce, the damage was already spreading. Gerald Farrow had returned to his hotel by 9 o'clock and placed 2 telephone calls, one to his production coordinator at Cinecittà Studios, the other to a colleague at Paramount's Rome office. He did not dramatize what he had witnessed. He simply described it, plainly, the way a man describes something he wants other people to understand clearly. By the following morning, the story was moving through Rome's film community the way stories move when they are true and require no embellishment. Through the costume houses on Via Condati, through the morning espresso conversations at the cafes around the Spanish Steps, through the makeup chairs at Cinecittà, where half of Hollywood was filming on Italian soil that summer. Nobody exaggerated it. The truth was sufficient. Within a week, 3 separate production companies had quietly redirected their private dining arrangements away from Ristorante Corsini. A senator's wife who had lunched there every Thursday for 11 years canceled her standing reservation without explanation. The restaurant did not empty overnight. It was too established, too embedded in Roman life for that. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence that now accompanied Marco Corsini when he moved between his tables. He felt it every evening. The way a room changes temperature when the people inside it have decided something about you. Corsini told his head waiter nothing. He told his family nothing. He went home each night, sat in his study, and stared at the wall with the particular expression of a man replaying a single moment on an endless loop, searching each time for the version where he makes a different choice. He never found it. If this story is reminding you why character matters more than status, subscribe and stay with us because we are just getting started. 6 weeks after that spring evening, a letter arrived at Audrey Hepburn's production office on the Via Margutta. It bore no return address, but the handwriting on the envelope was careful, deliberate, the script of a man who had written and rewritten the address several times before committing it to ink. Inside was a single page, no letterhead, no formal salutation. It was from Marco Corsini. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not attempt to explain himself or soften what he had done with the kind of language men use when they want absolution without accountability. He wrote simply that he had removed the private reservation policy from his establishment entirely, that a standing reservation had been arranged permanently and without charge in the name of Giuliana Mancini, and that he understood, if she never used it, why. He signed it with his full name, nothing else. Audrey read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the small wooden box she kept on her dressing table, the same box that held her mother's letters, a photograph from the liberation of Arnhem, and a dried flower from her first opening night in London. She never spoke of the letter publicly. She never mentioned Corsini's name in any interview. When journalists asked her, in later years, about using her fame to confront prejudice, she gave the same answer every time. "I don't think of it as using fame," she said. "I think of it as using eyes. Once you have seen certain things, you cannot pretend you haven't." Marco Corsini changed quietly, the way genuine change almost always happens, without announcement, without audience. His staff noticed first. A new hire in 1958, a young man from Naples with dark skin and a nervous handshake, was treated by Corsini with a particular, almost careful courtesy that the older employees had never seen from him before. By 1960, the composition of both his staff and his clientele had shifted in ways that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. No press release accompanied any of it, no public gesture of redemption. He simply became, table by table and year by year, a different kind of host. His daughter, Elena, noticed the wooden box on his desk in his final years. Inside it, a single folded page he had never sent a reply to. She asked him once what it was. He told her it was a reminder. She asked of what? He said, "Of the day someone showed me what I looked like from the outside and gave me the chance to become someone else." Giuliana Mancini gave one interview about that evening in 1987, 30 years after it happened. She had become, by then, a respected figure in Italian theater, her name well known in the circles that mattered to her. The journalist who interviewed her asked why she had never spoken about it publicly before. She said she had wanted to keep it for herself for a while. "Some things," she explained, "lose something when they are shared too soon." When the journalist asked whether she thought Audrey had understood the full impact of what she had done that night, Juliana smiled and was quiet for a moment. "That," she said finally, "is exactly why it worked. She had no idea. She wasn't performing courage. She simply could not sit still while something wrong was happening in front of her. There is a difference between those two things, and most people never learn it." Audrey Hepburn was appointed UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador in 1988. She spent the final years of her life traveling to some of the poorest and most forgotten corners of the world: Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, El Salvador, sitting on the ground with children, holding their hands, looking directly at them. Not performing compassion, simply refusing to look away. She died in January 1993 at her home in Switzerland, surrounded by the people she loved. There is a kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not rehearse its lines or calculate its audience. It simply stands up quietly, completely, when staying seated becomes impossible. Audrey Hepburn learned that in a darkened street in Arnhem when she was 10 years old. She carried it with her, without fanfare, for the rest of her life. And one spring evening in Rome, she set it down on a white linen tablecloth and walked out into the night.